Hi, welcome to Secrets Worth Sharing, a series all about having practical and approachable advice on talking about childhood sexual abuse, but with serious joy. I'm Sophia, a survivor and a designer, and this episode is all about child sexual abuse and humour. And for that, I'm joined by wonderful stand-up comedian Jonny Pelham.
Hello, it's really lovely to be here.
Thank you. So, who are you? Why are you sitting on this chair?
Well, I'm a stand-up comedian who has written a show about the experience of childhood sexual abuse, which is a lot funnier than it probably sounds.
In this section, we're going to share a couple of practical do's and don'ts for talking about childhood sexual abuse, particularly when it comes to humour. So, Jonny, should we start with the negatives? So, what are some of the don'ts when it comes to talking about child sexual abuse and humour?
One of the big ones is don't do it in a sort of crass or insensitive way. And I guess what I mean by that is more so when you tell people, often people try and make a joke to try and get rid of the anxiety. And I guess sometimes, you need to allow the person to be heard. Comedy is great when it's connecting. And so if you're connecting with the person, you can find humour in it. That's great. It happens organically. But, the amount of times I've told people they've just gone to some horrible joke hey, well, I always knew you were a bit fucking weird or something. You know what I mean? I just and it's coming from a good place of trying to de-stress, but actually sometimes you just need to sit in the moment of someone telling you about what's happened to them.
Do people now joke to you about your own experiences because you have done that yourself?
Yes, they do, and I guess I'm completely fine with it actually. Because I'm quite emotionally dead inside, so I'm quite able to not be very affected by what happened to me consciously.
This is not what we're advising our listeners. By the way.
Don't be dead inside. Yeah. Advice to be dead inside. It really numbs everything quite nicely. And well, again with that, I think it's all about trust and connection, isn't it? And there's some friends who I implicitly know really, really well. And I feel completely fine with them doing it. And then I did a radio interview with someone and he made a crass joke. And I didn't care actually, but afterwards I did think, that was crazy, that guy did that. and again, he was freaking out and was trying to chuck a blanket over the fire in himself and try to make a joke.
Yeah, I guess it's not necessarily always a pass for you to just joke along with the whole subject willy-nilly.
Exactly, yeah.
I have a don't that is kind of similar in terms of don't be crass with it.
Yeah.
Don't use kids in your comedy. Basically, in 2013, there was a video online and it was put on Funny or Die.
Yeah.
And it was by two comedians, Tiffany Haddish and Ari Spears. It was about a skit about what goes through the mind of a paedophile.
Yeah.
So basically, Tiffany Haddish is acting as a mum and she's leaving her 7-year-old son who's pretty much scantily naked throughout the whole skit in underwear, who's just come out the bath kind of thing, and leaves him with Ari Staines's character. And basically she's like, oh, thank you so much for looking after my son. And Ari Staines's character is playing a sex offender essentially. And then the whole rest of this clip is him rubbing baby oil into the child or watching the child through a newspaper with little eye holes cut out as he plays half naked with toys on the floor. And
there's is it a real
It's
kid?
real, it happened.
Oh my God.
Wait, as in...
Was there really a child?
There's a child acting in it, yeah.
That's so creepy. It's sort of beyond belief that even needs to be said not to do.
I know, but you know what? I just don't put anything past people nowadays.
Of course, yeah. God, that's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, because this happened in 2013, and basically there was another incident with the boy's sister where Tiffany Haddish basically showed her video of someone eating a sandwich in a very sexual way and then asked her to repeat it on camera. And then in 2022, once these kids had grown up, they basically filed a lawsuit against Tiffany and Aries to be you've caused us significant trauma.
Yeah.
And then that got plastered all over the press as these two are sex offenders, and there was a whole hoo-ha about it. And then the original two people, but they retracted their accusation and they basically were we're going to settle this, we don't want to prosecute any further. And I think regardless of what you think about that case, children can't consent to comedy, especially when they're of a sexual nature. Regardless of the intention there, either it was to take the piss out of paedophilic behaviour or child sexual offenders or whatever it is, you are still recreating a situation where you're putting that child in harm. There's no fakery about it to the child. It feels like the only time we ever talk about child sexual abuse is when we're joking about paedophiles or child sex offenders. And it's, this is a very extreme example of what happens when you take that way too far.
I really agree with that. I mean, the example of actually having a child and rubbing lotion into them with a paedophilic thoughts happening is beyond belief, really.
Yeah.
But I think even on a lesser scale, I think it's something to comedians need to think about, is how much do you bring children into your material? Because even completely sidestepping the child sexual abuse question, it's still you're still bringing them into something they can't consent to and talking about them in a way. And so, I mean, that's like a grey line, but what you're talking about feels absolutely crazy that happened. Putting that into the conversation that children aren't consenting to these pictures or these videos you're putting up online is something that should be discussed. Who knows where that line gets drawn?
Yeah.
But it's a good conversation to be having.
And that kind of leads me to my second don't. Don't joke about the person's experience of abuse. Joke about society and the way it responds.
Yeah, that's great. I wish that was mine, really. That's the best one. That's what I did in my show. And when people say you can't talk about sexual abuse, and if people are messaging me saying, this isn't funny, this is awful, how can you talk about this? That's exactly what they're missing, is that I'm not talking about what happened to me as an 8-year-old. I'm talking about what happened to me, who the person that led me to be, and then how society, we don't know how to deal with this. And there's loads of humour in that. But you're right, there's nothing funny about the fact that me or you were sexually abused. So yeah, society's reaction is where the humour lies.
Yeah, and you know what, I'd even go as far as to say, like, sometimes the only thing I could do was laugh about it, because I was like, this situation is so batty that like all I can do is just have a laugh, otherwise I will just burst into tears, and that's not helpful at that moment.
I did exactly the same thing. I remember when I was trying to set up a Tinder profile, and I was like, do I put child sexual abuse victim who's never had sex? You know, and if someone's into that, they're not the right person. But you know what I mean? It's like, how do you, like, humour is such a good way to deal with it, because you deal with dark things because you're right, the alternative to humour is just to be really sad. You know what I mean? And actually, like, you can, again, that's one of the things about doing it on the Apollo and things, is I think no one wants to have really serious, depressing conversations. And so if you limit child sexual abuse to a space where we can only talk about it in those ways, you limit it to really intense, negative things that then you go, right, that was crap, I've talked about it now, I'll never do that again. And actually, one of the ways to make this mainstream, or, you know, like conversations about it mainstream, is to talk about it in ways where there's tonal variety. And it doesn't mean you don't need those intense, serious conversations. You know, the first time you tell people, it probably is going to be really intense. But then if you want to live with this as part of your identity, you probably do need to find ways to talk about it that isn't going to mean that your day's ruined.
Have you got any more don'ts?
So the other don't is quite specific to comedy, but is don't heckle. How often people think people heckle is much less than they actually do on the whole in comedy. But when I disclose my views, a lot of people would heckle. I would say on a percentage more people. And I think it's exactly what I was saying earlier about people freaking out about something that they can't control, and so they would shout something out to try and dispel the anxiety either the audience or they're feeling. And what that does is I thought a lot about what I'm saying, and I've crafted it and spent time to make it a certain way, and then interrupting that, it turns it into there's a need there to dilute something. And so I guess I would say, if you do go to a comedy show and someone starts disclosing anything, well, firstly, just don't heckle. But particularly when someone's disclosing something that is quite personal, is just don't dive in. People thinking that me saying the word abuse or me saying the word paedophile means that I'm going to make a crass joke. Whereas actually I'm saying, this is my lived experience and I'm able to talk about it and make jokes about it. In my stand-up, I say something like, I'm going to talk about it for the next hour, and if you do want to leave, that's totally fine and you won't be picked on. So so I'm basically saying you can leave if you want.
Yeah.
Because I don't want someone sat there for an hour having an awful time.
Yeah.
And worried that if they leave, I'm going to slam them.
I always forget, because like there's that whole joke about not sitting in the front row either, isn't there?
Yeah.
Comedy show. Yeah.
But I think it's important because I have no desire to make someone feel uncomfortable in any way.
Which I guess leads on to the do's.
Yes.
Are there any positive do's that you think people should do when they're talking about child sex abuse?
So I guess it's to just go in with an open heart and mind, really. I guess it's such a taboo topic to try and let yourself hear what the person's saying rather than bring in your own sort of presuppositions or your own biases or your own thoughts about it that are normally going to be incredibly negative. So I think that's what it's just to try and hear it in a way that is authentic.
One of the things that you just said earlier that I think is a great do is, do you give people an option to get out of the conversation or to leave, because it actually never occurred to me before about the whole thing about people leaving, getting picked on. But yeah, I imagine that being quite a very real fear. And I guess you already know that you're going to be talking about a topic that's either controversial or not talked about often. And I think what's great is you said in your comedy, you can leave now, you're not going to get picked on, that's totally fine.
Yeah.
It creates a safety without it being overly focused on the person and how they're going to respond.
Totally, yeah. And I think one of the things this has made me do about just allowing people to have different reactions. You know, I think that's where when people are critical of my work, I don't feel like fuck them. I just feel like that's all right. We don't know how to talk about this as a society. You think I'm doing it the wrong way. That's totally cool. Because it's so personal and so difficult and we're all figuring it out. You know, no one knows how to do this really. Because a few of my friends got annoyed with some of the people who are saying negative things. I just think that's how they're managing whatever they're managing in their lives.
Yeah.
And it's probably not healthy that they're on Twitter calling me a twat. But that's sort of their own thing, isn't it, really?
Yeah, that's so graceful, Jonny. I mean, to be honest, I'm not big enough of a platform to like warrant that enough trolls yet. Hopefully it grows.
You want those trolls?
Yeah, I want them trolls because it means I'm growing. But you know, like when people call you like a trauma dumper or that this isn't really helping anybody, and those conversations can be intensely tricky for me. Or for example, when your personal experience becomes politicized. For example, there's a whole thing about right-wing politicians taking trans people and like painting them out to be sex offenders and all of that kind of thing, which I'm totally not about on this platform, but sometimes my work gets shared and all of that by those individuals, and I worry about what's going to happen next with it.
Well, anyone who's on Twitter having a go at you, it's like, what's happening in their life? You know what I mean? Like, they're not thriving, I would suggest. I can really imagine, though, your work being used politically, campaigning for things that you don't agree with, that would be very difficult. Yeah. Because that feels like the power of the troll is nothing, whereas the power of the politician, you actually then sweat. I'd find that very hard.
Yeah,
I'd want
you're
to be
part of a
fuck off.
movement. Yeah. It's like, I don't want to be part of this movement.
Another do would be questioning how we talk about child sexual abuse so often in comedy. Like the amount of times I am at a particularly new material gig and the joke is extreme sexual violence towards children or women. You know what's crazy about it is how many men, it is normally men, you know, like 90% of the time, they're like 40 and they have kids and a job and they get to the open mics and they just start talking about how they've got a kid in their basement and they think it's like funny. And what it is, what the really fascinating thing about it is you'll talk to them off stage and they'll be warm, chatty, clearly a loving dad, whatever. And then they go on stage and they're just joking about fucking kids and raping, you know, prostitutes or whatever.
And it goes back to power. I know I keep going on about your experiences and the way you use comedy to tell your story, right? But like, we need to think about what the power is there. Like,
definitely.
If you're someone who's statistically way more likely to lock a kid in a basement or to rape a woman or whatever it is, and then you're just bashing around, like pulling on that statistic and laughing about it, like, what actually are you serving there?
I completely agree. And I think also it's about lived experience, isn't it? You know, I can talk about it because I've had the experience and I can talk about it in a nuanced way. Whereas if the punchline is, you never write a punchline really where the joke is, I fucked a kid. It's like, you know what I mean?
Do you know what I found really challenging? Because like we're recording this just after the whole Russell Brand thing and all of those scandals coming out, and like even just looking back at his comedy now, when he defends it, it's very like, oh, but I'm just a sexual person. Yeah. I don't understand what's funny about it. It's like you're using the camaraderie of being a comedian to continually push the boundaries, and then it's no longer an act. Then it is abuse. Like I've seen him just roll up and like kiss presenters. That's not a joke anymore. You're using the joke as a guise to actually do those abusive behaviours.
As a comedian, I would say you have to be able to justify every joke you tell on stage. Just be very clear about every joke having a political ramification, and just knowing and being sure you can justify what you say, at least to yourself, because that's really the only person you can check with, I guess.
I'd love to know what you think about this. So you're talking about comedians starting out and finding their voice. I can imagine when you're writing those kinds of jokes, you're like, okay, what is something that's a guaranteed giggle? Child sex offenders, everyone knows it's safe material in the sense that it's society a very frowned upon thing. It's very easy to make them the butt of the joke.
Yeah.
It's a kind of way to get in a few quick, cheap gags kind of thing. And, you know, I've seen it done really well. Then there's an element when it gets too far, or there's an element when it stifles other conversations, like, or other material related to child sexual abuse that then doesn't get a voice because of all of the nonce jokes.
Yeah. I think you're completely right that it's a very good way to get a quick laugh. If you put Jimmy Savile at the end of a line, it will get a reaction. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so I think there is still a need, particularly like you say, when you're finding your voice, you just go to the quickest way. Comedians need the right to fail. Because I guess I'd be very reticent to try and like police what comedians say. But I do then think comedians should be accountable for what they say. And the problem with it is it's very hard to make any hard and fast rules because it's always nuanced.
Yeah. Which leads me to my final do.
Yeah.
Which is, do remember that comedy is a hopeful outlet. We've talked about it many a time on this podcast. We need more ways to have this conversation safely, practically, approachably, joyfully, lightheartedly. All of the ways that you don't typically think a conversation on child sexual abuse should run. And so remember that comedy is another form of having that outlet.
I think that my Edinburgh show in 2019 was a hopeful show. It began with me talking about how I was sexually abused as a child, didn't have sex until I was 25, was living in a squat, daydreamed all the time. And then I went to therapy, and then it ended with me in a relationship, having regular sex, living in the suburbs. Yeah, banging 24/7. We're not, obviously not, unless I'm doing that. The politics comes out of that hope, like you say, because then it's like, look, this happened for me, and if we can start talking about this, we can help other people, and we can start having a society, we can have a better society. And so you're right, comedy is hopeful.
You need to be in the right place to come public with this story, so it felt like a natural time for you. So.
It did, and I think that's something I would say, is if you're going to disclose something personal, really think about the consequences of it.
Yeah. And
really make sure you are prepared. Because, you can find yourself on Apollo.
What a flex, what a way to end it. Thank you so much, Jonny, for coming and chatting with me. I've learnt so much, I've had a laugh.
It's been great. I've seen it's such a fantastic thing you do. I think it's really brilliant. So well done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to what we had to say about this theme. Did you know you can also find the longer version of the episode and the Do's and Don'ts episode in the same place on our website? Just head to www.secretsworthsharing.com/content and you can find all the episodes linked by theme alongside the transcripts, written text versions of the Do's and Don'ts, and video versions of all of our content. See you there. Thank you for having a difficult conversation with serious joy. Bye.